this two-story house with a basement that the band was living in. And down in the basement they had a printing press, which they were printing, you know, White Panther manifestos, because they were in league with the Black Panthers. And the guys in the band wouldn't, but John Sinclair was generally up on the roof shooting at the cops along with the other guys. So, I mean, down in the basement they had the printing press and guns. You know, and
what kind of house? Can you bring that back
it was
to mind?
it was just like a Victorian.
It wasn't a row house. It was like a separate house. Or,
separate house, yeah.
A Victorian two-story.
Yeah, two-story.
On
you
what
know,
kind of street? What kind of area?
Very residential. Nothing. Very nondescript. You wouldn't have a clue what was going down
Was
there.
the lawn mowed? I mean, could we?
It was in fairly decent shape. Yes, they kept up the pretense, but I mean, there were all these so-called long-haired hippie bastards, you know, that were against the government, and you know, the beginnings of protest. You know,
And they're down in the basement cranking out the
manifesto,
yeah.
and you know, and ready go out there and do the gig, and after the gig, go up on the roof and shoot at the cops, and go back and do another gig. So, I remember I was terrified. I mean, I remember going around the house and feeling, and I was dressed like a dandy. I had this blue suede leather Edwardian jacket and black leather pants. I mean, here's this Hollywood dandy in there, you know, inside this revolutionary House of Revolution. It was really uncomfortable. I remember calling my wife up, and we'd only been married a month, and I said, honey, you better remember me because that may be it. and then we went to the gig afterwards, Jack and I got out of there.
How many guys would be in the house? Like, is it heavily populated?
Yeah, it was pretty heavily populated. There were a good 20, 30 people in the house. I mean, they were the women. You know, it was run like a commune, you know, and Sinclair was the leader, and then there was the propaganda minister. I mean, there really was, you know, and you know they had a line and people listened to it. And I mean, I'm glad to see Fred Sonic Smith is alive. You know, his wife is Patti Smith, the artist, so he's still around. A lot of the guys are still around. It was a good band. It was a very good band. You know, after a while, Sinclair getting busted and. You know, like he got busted, and the whole thing just kind of started to peter away. And they really didn't have the greatest songs, but they were fun. They were a lot of fun. But after the recording, I remember coming back to L.A. and I mixed it by myself, sent it to Jack, and he okayed it, and it came out, and that had to kick out Jam's Motherfuckers. And we all thought it was kind of cool, you know, because it's kind of good to be in position and kind of taunt a little bit, but you know, still keep one foot in business and you know, never really put yourself out there so you get hurt. Well, this album hurt us, and I don't know if you've ever seen the original cover. Well, it says on the inside the opener it says "Kick out the Jams, motherfuckers," and it had all the guys standing there with these "Kick out the Jams, motherfuckers" buttons, almost like, you know, with in their skin, you know, but it really wasn't. They were just kind of, and there was a whole manifesto that had been written by Sinclair and his propaganda minister. Well, to the best of my recollection, some little store like Sears or whatnot, they had a record collection. Some mother was in there with her little boy, and Mom said, "Buy me this," and he said, "Buy me this." So Mom bought it. And they went home. You know, the kid didn't know what it was. Mom didn't know what it was. Put on the first thing is out of the speakers. Said, "Kick out the jams, motherfuckers." She went ballistic, and went back to the store or the company, which was a major national chain. And they went ballistic, and they contacted Jack, and they said, "You clean this album up, pull it from a thing, or I guarantee you." Then not only will we not sell your records, we don't care who your artist is, but we'll call it Sears. And I think it was Montgomery Ward that was the one that had it. But we'll call Sears. We'll call anybody in Chicago. We'll call everybody, and we are going to blacklist you. That would have been the death of this record company. And the Doors had happened by this time. You know, we were into Waiting for the Sun, the third album already, was selling huge, you know. And this is just what Jac needed. So I remember Jac calling me and saying, we're in trouble. But Jac always had the presence of mind to record things in front to protect ourselves. And when we did the recording, he said, what I'd like to do, we'll record the whole thing live, and then we'll record it in the Grandy Ballroom the next day without any kids there, so we can have another performance to cut to. Since it's so loud, nobody will ever know anyway. You could cut in the first note and the last note, and you'd have applause, and the rest would be, you know, a good studio recording. You know, Jac was always thinking how to protect himself. So he also had the presence of mind to have them record it, change motherfuckers into brothers and sisters. So we had all this backup. So immediately he called me and he says, we're in trouble. I said, well, what's happening? And he told me the story. And I said, well, we got all that stuff. You know, we have all that backup tracks. He says, put it in there, remaster it yesterday. And then they came out with a whole new cover, the same cover, but without all the offensive stuff was gone. They put it out there. But almost by that time, the damage had been done. It took a while for Elektra's credibility to come back. Then the band took out a full-page ad in, I think, Billboard or one of the big trades, condemning Jac. And I said, Elektra Records is not being, you know, honest and being the establishment, and, you know, on and on and on. So Jac, just looking at one hand, you know, the survival of Elektra Records versus this band, he dropped the band. And we had already taken them into the studio in LA by this point and recorded 2 more songs. Which eventually, what he did is he dropped the band, and Atlantic Records picked them up. John Landau produced the album, which is Back in the USA, I think it was called, or something like that. And the 2 songs, Call Me an Animal, and I don't remember what the other one was there. Went over there. But that was a real interesting experience. I think it was Jac's foray into protesting, you know, beyond folk songs, and got a little too close. Moth got a little too close to the flame. We almost got burnt. But later on, I think through the Freedom of Information Act, you'll have to check with Jac on this, but I do believe that both he and I had been investigated by the FBI because of this whole thing. Because at that point in time, they were, you know, with the weather, you know, the weathermen and the White Panthers and the Black Panthers and all this political unrest in the country, they were investigating everything. But I never, you know, physically, you know, felt anything. I don't think Jac did either, because he made the moves to get out of it. So I think they basically dropped it. But I think Jac had found out through the Freedom of Information Act that we had to investigate it. And I think another thing that they had there's a famous story about them when they took that out. Then they did a concert, and 2 of the guys actually took a dump on the stage, bared their asses, took a dump on the stage, and then took the ad and rubbed it in it or something like that, held it up to see these guys are like, it got beyond, you know, because we hadn't dealt with anybody like that. Everybody was nice, you know, within reason, you know, crazy but nice, you know. So that was a pretty interesting time. Why don't we stop for a minute and let me.
What we're going to take a look at now is just kind of identifying Elektra in the range of music companies and so on.
In the 60s, 70s, all record companies had their own studios. Even Elektra had a little one in New York. And it was basically a mix-down facility where you could overdub a vocal or something like that. Up on the 2nd floor, it wasn't 1840 because that's Atlantic. I think it was right on Broadway. Since all the companies had their own studios, they had their own sound. And you could identify a record just by listening to it. what record company it was. I'm blindfolded. You could say, oh, that's a Columbia record, because they use tape delay on all their echo. And it's really heavy on the echo. You could tell an Atlantic record because they were so dry and with no high end and real funky, because that was Ahmet's thing. And you could tell an Elektra record because the emphasis was on really good recording, a really clear audio file, and also you could tell an Elektra record because of the type of acts that were drawn to it. If you look at the roster of acts during the folk era, and then the changeover in the 60s, 63, to Love and the Doors, and, and the other bands that came in after that, and single artists, and then the ones that transcended it, like Judy Collins. There was a style, and because the Doors were there, another act would want to be there. And Elektra put out quality records. Not only did they put out, they were a true record company from the standpoint they followed Jac's eclectic taste. They put out rock and roll. They put out folk music. They put out classical through Nonesuch. He did how to do records, which none of the other ones did. Morse code, how to play a bass, how to play a guitar. He did some Music -1 records. He did comedy records with Lord Buckley. Wonderful album. It's got the Naz on it. I mean, just some incredible stuff that's on there. On the Explorer label, he had all really interesting music from different countries. You could learn about drums and music from Bali and, all the gamelons and all that. I mean, Jac's taste and interest ran so far afield that he lived it. And because the Doors were such a huge success and there was such a huge infusion of money all at once, he was able to go out and just live his dreams. And his dreams were his record company. His dreams weren't going out and buying a Porsche, living that kind of life. That wasn't of any interest to him, but doing the rest was. So, I mean, that is the difference between Elektra and Atlantic and Columbia, and even Capitol Records had a sound of their own. They all did. And then as the studios, the companies stopped having their own record companies, they started using places like Sunset Sound, United Recorders, and using independent and getting ready. So everybody started to get a very similar sound. Everybody was recording everywhere. And it lost its identity. It's a thing that I regret to this day, because it's like radio has changed so much. And radio in those days would, like KFWB here was the top pop station here in LA. But they would play Frank Sinatra and the Doors right after, one after the other. Jefferson Airplane and Tony Bennett, or it was, and then they'd play the Chipmunks. It was like there was a melding of styles, and in those days it was nothing for me to do commercials in the morning, maybe the children's album afterwards, and then go and do the Doors in the afternoon, and then or do a jazz date here, and so what I'd learn from one, I'd bring into another, and which is I think it's really good. A lot of the kids that are recording today don't have a clue. They only record one kind of music. That's all they've ever known, and most of them have never even known how to record anything live. It's all one instrument at a time. In those days, we did things live. If you consider we were recording 3 and 4 track, didn't have a lot. You had to make decisions. Today, making a decision live is the only place it happens is generally in movies. Now, where we will, like last week, day before yesterday, I had a 102-piece orchestra. We record live. Even though it's going to a 48 track, I'm still printing to 3 channels of left, center, right. And you got to make a decision. Thank you, because they got to get right on the dubbing stage and out to the world it goes. And record company, Elektra also, the way it sounded and the way it tasted was Jac's taste in music and his, what he wanted to hear. It's like any company The strength of the company is as good as the person that started it and is running it and basically has, quote unquote, control and is able to implement his taste on it. And everybody that's working there wants to be a part of that taste, likes the way the flavor, and it isn't the flavor of the month, it's the flavor that you want to live. And Jac was able to attract, as Amit was able to attract, and as the other labels were able to attract lots of people that had a similar sensitivity. It's like I didn't realize that New York was such a blues town until after I started going there with Jac. Jac flew me to New York at one point because he decided he wanted to expand the studio in New York. And I had been doing a little bit of recording there with Tom Rush for Jac in his little studio there on Broadway, 1855 Broadway. And it was very, very primitive, but it did work, and it did sound good. And he said, we're going to be taking offices across the street at the new Gulf Western building. And let's build a studio. And this is the space that's available. And we had already had the plans for the studio in Los Angeles. This is before I'd gotten married. This is 1967. And he asked me to come join the company. So he asked me to come back to New York with him. I was pretty naive, 22 years old. And my first trip to New York ever, and I stayed at his house, his apartment, down in the Village. And I remember we flew back at night on the red eye. In those days it was a 707. And Jac liked to sleep, but he never wanted to miss a business day. So in those days in the 707, and he flew first class, they had a little bench just outside the first class seats that was for the stewards to sit down. That you could, if you wanted to lay down on it, you could, you'd have to curl up. He commandeered the bench and told the stewardess to go sit in his seat. He won. And then we got to New York and we were picked up. At that time he did have a driver, and taken to his apartment. And I remember going upstairs, and the first time I was in the city, and I saw nothing but concrete, trees. I mean, I grew up. I was born out here when in the 60s, 50s, 60s, this didn't have half the population that it has now. There were a lot of trees. It was very blue skies all the time, clouds, and no smog. It was a real nice place. Get to New York, get in his apartment, and I get upstairs, and I'm bummed out by the city. I mean, I didn't realize that I would be, but I was bummed out because I wasn't used to this. I felt claustrophobic. So he says, come to the window, look at this. And he points down into the garden. He says, you see that tree down there? And this thing didn't have any leaves on it. It was scrawny. He says, it's my tree. I planted that tree. And I looked at him, and I got even more freaked. and I thought to myself, live in New York? I mean, it just didn't make any sense all of a sudden, in my brain. But I didn't know how to tell Jac anything about it. Anyway, so I remember going over to the offices and spending time with him, and we're looking at the things, looking at the plans. And somehow or another, it just didn't gel with me. And then we came back to LA. About 10 months later, he came up with another idea to do it there. And by that time, I'd been back to New York about 6 or 8 times, and I'd gotten into the city. And I mean, I remember one of my first nights there, stepping out of the office, and it must have been about 9 or 10 o'clock at night. And it was about 90 degrees outside. And I had lit up a joint in those days, I partaked. And I remember staring across Central Park at 59th Street and seeing all those hotels and those buildings and looking at all those windows. And I all of a sudden got this hit of an anthill, that we were in this anthill. And I must have sat out there for about an hour just staring at it, and just kind of like coming to grips with the whole thing. And that's when I decided that, yeah, actually it was a cool place after all, even though it was an anthill, and I felt sorry for the fact that people were having to live that close to one another. I mean, Jac was used to it. I mean, that was his thing. Later on, he couldn't get enough space between he and his neighbor. But at that time, it's all he had ever known. So it was normal. Me, I was having a total adverse reaction and not being very positive about living in New York. But by that time, I thought, hey, it'll be cool. Then I met my wife, and we decided to get married. And then at that point, Jac said, no, I'm not going to do this to you. I'm not going to bring you to New York and have to bring your new wife to New York and find a place, because I won't be able to pay you enough to live in the way you can live in Los Angeles. So instead, I went to work for him at Elektra. And he had, boy, I'm scattered. There's so many things that come into my mind right now. Let me stop for a minute. Let me put another CD in. Spacing out and going in all different kinds of directions. I think we left off with building the studio in New York, and because I was getting married, Jac decided to do it out here. And we built the Elektra facility at 926 North La Cienega. At that time, he had hired on John Haney, an engineer. John was I don't know whether he was chief engineer or what. I had been offered that position and I didn't want it because I was too fully engrossed in the Doors records and producing and things like that, and didn't feel I wanted to run the show. Like here, I'm a part owner here, but I'm not running the show. It just gets in the way of my creative. So anyway, the studio was being built. We had a fellow named Alan Emick. Have you heard of him?
Just heard of him.
Yeah, he's gone, unfortunately, but he's was one of the best mixers ever. He did Dave Brubeck's Take 5 is one of his things. He did a lot of the original Toscanini. I can't remember the conductor. Big classical recordings out here. Anyway, he also built Sense of Sound recorders. He was an alcoholic. He was gay. He was a great person. He lived life to the fullest. He left Sense. The funny thing is how all these things come together in life is very strange. When I got out of high school, I went to work at Liberty Records recording studio as an apprentice engineer. And for 2 years and didn't make a dime. I didn't care. I would have paid them. And when they closed down, that's where we were doing the Chipmunks and Johnny Burnett and Bobby V and all the Liberty Records, that kind of stuff that they were doing. I was on the street looking for a job. And I had gotten this job basically through my father, who was a musician, who was friends with a fellow named Felix Slatkin, who was a producer.
What's your father's name?
Norman Botnick, and this is him right there. This is with the Ted Fiorito Orchestra, and this is the early 20s. This is the very first double-deck touring bus in the United States, and this is what the band used to go in. And this is Betty Grable. She was 18 years old. And Leif Erikson, the actor, he was 18. Nobody in this band was over 22. And they all look like they're 100, because they're all European stock. And Muzzy Marcelino was in this band. This was the big, these were the Rolling Stones of the 20s, these guys. And Paul Whiteman's orchestra and George Olsen. So anyway, my dad and Felix had been in the Army together, and Felix was a stockholder in Liberty Records at the time. And the guy that owned it was Lenny Waronker's father, Cy Waronker. And Lenny Waronker was the president of Warner Brothers up until recently. And they got me this job there as an apprentice because I had been recording in school and I really had shown affinity, and this is what I wanted to do. I didn't want to go to college, and in fact I went to college and for one day. And when I saw in the class, this was at City College, how the guy was putting a microphone on a stand, I knew he was doing it wrong, and I just walked out of the class and never came back. And I mean, I was only 16 years old. I knew more than the guy did. So through this period of, that's when I met Jack Nucci up there, and Leon Russell and David Gates, who's done Jack's new label. And with Brad, I knew him then. We were all just the same age. You know, I was just out of high school, and they were just in from Oklahoma. So I used to hang out a lot with David Gates and Leon Russell because they lived together in the same house. They shared a house. So we used to hang in those days. And this is well before David Gates came in with Brad at Elektra. I mean, I remember when Jack called me up and said, well, I've got this group with this guy, David Gates. I want to do a demo. I said, David Gates? You got to be kidding. You know, I've known David Gates for 100 years. So we'll get to that. But anyway, so when Liberty sold, I don't remember who they sold to. No, that wasn't it. They hired a guy named Eddie Brackett from United Recording, which was Bill Putnam's studio, where Jack did record the Horoscope album. He had been recording all the hit stuff for Snuff Garrett, and who had produced Bobby V and Johnny Burnett and all those kinds of stuff. We had also were in there, we're doing the Ventures, who became friends of mine as well. And they hired Eddie to work for Liberty as basically Snuff's engineer, and they closed the studio down and redid it, and I was on the street looking for a job. So I had a lot of experience by that time as a second, but I'd been recording on my own there, bringing my bands in. In those days, they were big bands. I wasn't doing rock and roll. Rock and roll was a horrible thing, you know. I was into jazz and other stuff.